Welcome to another special edition of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. As we're recording this shortly before October of 2020, we're entering a very special anniversary, a momentous occasion in the history of video gaming, the 1980 AMOA show. And in order to really delve into this event and how it was a revolutionary, transitional, paradigm-setting event in the history of video games, we've brought on an expert. You know him already from his work doing our amazing sound effects and correcting me whenever I'm wrong every month. Ethan from History of How We Play. Welcome to the show, Ethan.
Thank you very much, Karl. Thank you for having me.
Always, well, not always, it's first time, but hey, it's a pleasure. So let's get started first. Introduce yourself to everybody who may not have already visited your website.
So my name's Ethan Johnson. I've been in this sort of video game history preservation stuff for about 5 years. I serve as an editor for Gaming Alexandria, which does a lot of scanning and dumping of games and things like that. And I have my own blog called The History of How We Play, which you can find at thehistoryofhowweplay.wordpress.com. And
link to the show notes below.
Yes, indeed. I would hope. And I've done a lot of work helping with authors and stuff. You can see some of this on my blog. I do kind of year summaries, and I'll say the things that I've helped with. I've helped with a couple books. I've helped with some videos by people like Norm, the gaming historian, and Wrestling with Gaming. You know, I'm just a general all-round research kind of guy. So if people need help finding stuff, then I'm somebody you can go to, and I'm pretty much happy to help anybody as long as you're, on the level.
Excellent. So with that being said, now this is an important moment now, but we need to set the stage. So tell us a little bit about the AMOA, the history of it, what it means, and in this moment in 1980, what has it gone through to be what it is at this time?
So the reason I wanted to come around and talk about the 1980 AMOA is because for me, it kind of signals a transition in the way that games are made, the types of games that become popular. And I'll talk about this more when we get to the actual game show and exhibition and stuff like that. But I think that it is kind of an overlooked moment in history that I kind of wanted to illuminate. As soon as I heard of your podcast, I was basically like, I hope they do a lot on the 1980 AMOA. And then, since I got in with you guys, then I was like, okay, maybe I can just talk about it because I have thoughts about this. So this is a good format in which to actually explore that. So the AMOA is a trade show. Well, it's a trade organization and a trade show.
What does AMOA stand for?
It stands for the Amusement and Music Operators of America. It was originally the Music Operators of America, which we'll talk about in a sec. A lot of people have a very, in gaming especially, have a very dissonant view of what a trade show is supposed to be, because E3 became this consumer-centric, this is where the games are revealed and, you get hype press releases out of it and whatnot. But, in basically any other industry, you would not call that a trade show. A trade show is for industry insiders. It's a moment where you can make connections with other people in the business and you gauge feedback on your products. So this is not something that they're advertising to a wider base, and occasionally some people that are not strictly in the industry can get in. But generally, you have to be part of the industry. So the coin-op industry has had trade shows for decades. Originally, or I should stop for a sec. So it's a trade organization is sort of generally kind of a loose connective tissue between all the major and minor players that they can rally around. And usually this is for the purposes of lobbying, for lobbying groups, so that they can stop laws that might prevent the growth of their business and whatnot. So the coin-op organizations, there were a bunch of regional organizations, and they started coming together right after the pinball boom, basically. And so what became the coin machine industry group was formed in 1933, and they had their annual show for all those years following that. But there was something going on that the music operators, which is where this part comes into the story, needed to fight against. And basically, there was going to be a change to the United States copyright law. By the way, this is all United States stuff. Other countries do also have these lobbying organizations and trade shows and whatnot. And you've talked about a couple of the trade shows on your podcast. But in this case, this is a U.S. centric thing. So there was going to be an amendment to the 1909 Copyright Act that basically exempted jukebox owners from paying public performance fees. When a performer performs a piece of music at a venue, they have to pay a particular fee, or the venue owner has to pay a fee to the publisher of that music so that they have the right to perform that music. Jukeboxes were exempt from this, going all the way back to this 1909 Copyright Act, back when there barely was any jukeboxes, but they were phonographs, and there wasn't really the concern that you would have a ton of music on site, because it would pretty much be just like one record, or you would change them out by hand. But now we're getting into the point in the 40s where there's 100 selection jukeboxes and things like that. So you have all these rights kind of hanging up in the air, and basically the music publishers want to stop the jukebox owners from being exempt from this fee.
Now, what year are we talking about here?
1948 is 1948. When this is kind of coming to a head. I think the bill is in like 1947. They're starting to push it through Congress. And basically, because the coin machine industry, the organization, didn't really know how to cope with the music side of things. They were more game focused. The jukebox companies, the distributors, the operators felt that they were being neglected. So during the 1948 CMI show in January, they held an unofficial meeting to get together and start hashing out what is the stuff that they can do about this.
Now, it was headed by who are doing this are the jukebox operators and manufacturers.
And distributors.
Distributors, but not the music publishers.
No, they're going against the music publishers, basically. Of course. They are counter lobbying. So the Music Operators of America was headed by this guy named George Miller, and so they did this sort of unofficial meeting, and then they were like, okay, let's actually make this a continual thing. And it was going to just be part of the CMI show. So while the ongoing lobbying efforts go on, and they are successful in protecting themselves from having to pay like a fee for every song that they have to put in the jukebox. Just to wrap up that story, it's not very important to the gaming stuff. But they continue meeting as part of the CMI show. But since they felt disillusioned about everything, they didn't really feel like they could keep on with that they needed to have their own show and do their own thing. And at the same time, CMI itself is starting to collapse, because in 1949, they put down a rule that if you manufacture slot machines, we're not going to represent you anymore. We're purely for representing game companies. And a lot of the major...
What do you mean by AIM companies?
Game companies that would be making pinball and not Shuffle Alleys yet, but all these old mechanical games. Electromechanical was slow coming into things, but the major people who were hurt by this was Bally, who were a major concern, and basically they decide to front a move out of the CMI to form their own organization called the ACMMA. It's not important what that means. But basically, the game people start siphoning off to one show. The music people start siphoning off to another show. and there's a very narrow band of people left supporting the CMI. And so the CMI steadily disintegrates. Basically, I think it wraps up in 1952. But the first AMOA show is held at the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago on March 6th to 8th in 1950. So the 1981 is the 30th show, which is auspicious. The people who did the game stuff basically were not allowed at the MOA show, even though it would become this industry-wide organization. It was advertised specifically as an all-music show. So the game people were left doing their own thing, but the AC MMA show only went on for 2 years, and then it fell apart, due to lack of support and things like that. So they start showing their stuff at what's called the Park Show, the NAPPA, which comes up occasionally in later years. It's more of a amusement park based show. Mm. So, if you're trying to get something into an amusement park, you would show it at the Park Show. So that's where the game people go. And steadily over time, the MOA kind of relaxes, what they're actually representing, because there's a lot of crossover, especially with distributors. The distributors were defined along what manufacturer of jukebox they did, Seeburg, Rowe, AMI, but they would also sell games. So over time, it's like, we're flying all the way out here to Chicago, so why are we having to go to an entirely different show down in New Orleans, which is where the Park Show was, to actually, get all of our product? So MOA starts allowing games back in. They do it very slowly. First in 1955, so 5 years later, and then the first pinball game to appear on the show floor, because pinball still had this stigma attached to gambling machines, appears in 1958 from Chicago Coin. So it starts becoming more of a holistic industry organization. And over time, it starts to become clear that the games are not just a sideshow. It's a very steady process. The jukebox, kind of reaches its height in the 60s. But by the end of the 60s, it's starting to go down because there are speaker systems that can pipe music through overhead. So you don't have to give patrons the option to choose their favorite songs anymore, and you don't need to have a jukebox as the sound source, which is the primary thing. You can hear it in the entire restaurant or whatever. So through the 70s, the music starts to contract a bit. Jukeboxes are still relevant to the end of the 80s, and there's still a presence at the MOA show. But as video games start to come in, and these special electromechanical games, which are also making a splash at the same time, things like air hockey and Periscope from Sega, earlier than that, they rejigger their focus. And therefore, in 1976, the organization changes its name to the AMOA, the Amusement and Music Operators of America. So, finally got away from that sort of, just the music roots that, we weren't even going to allow games on the show floor anymore. And of course, it was pretty much even though 1976 wasn't exactly the year that games took over, it was a good presage of things to come. Of course, in 1978 at the AMOA show, they introduced Space Invaders, and that kicks off the boom. And then you get tons of manufacturers in, and of course the slow encroachment of the Japanese manufacturers. Don't know if we need any more context before we get into the show itself.
No. So that's the history of the show. Now, going into 1980, what is the status of the industry? Obviously, we've had Space Invaders, we've had Breakout, Pong way before that. But most of those games are coming from newly established companies that weren't necessarily in the coin-op industry before, like Atari and so forth. So what is the industry, what does the breakdown at an AMOA show, let's say in 1979, look like? Is it very distinct sections? This company does this company does that?
Well, there was importing by the big firms, and this is something that we'll get to a little bit later. Bally, of course, was the people who were importing Space Invaders, but then there was starting to be an encroachment of the actual Japanese companies themselves. So there, basically, at the 1980 AMOA, there is a lot of newcomers. Atari isn't really a newcomer anymore, but the sort of old hands in the business, in the manufacturing end, are debuting video games basically for the first time because they have to. They have to get on this trend, or otherwise they're not going to be making money anymore.
Let's establish what the world looked like in 79 so that we can see the distinction with 1980.
Okay.
Because you don't have, in 79, there's virtually no Japanese company bringing in their own product. Mm-hmm. Most of it's getting relabeled. You don't even know most of the time who the original manufacturer was. And you don't have the big American pinball or slot machine makers in the space yet. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, because obviously I don't know as much about it as you do. That's not part of the industry that I've delved into so much. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, that is a good way of looking at it, And at the 1979 AMOA show, there was more of an even split between pinball and video games. So you had the solid-state pinball revolution, which was basically just reaching its height in 1979 and then took a sharp decline after that. So you do have these established Chicago companies that are basically not in video games, and the couple of Japanese games that are imported, like Galaxian, are showcased and they're doing big business, but there is no real connection there. There's not, even though some of these companies do have a facility in the United States, they aren't sort of being an active part of the industry in 1979. The old Chicago companies and the new video game companies that, meant to ride the wave, like Cinematronics, Exidy, Atari, are the ones who are taking up the limelight at that show.
Gotcha. So that brings us then to 1980. So bring us into the AMOA show in 1980. Okay.
So it was held October 30th to November 2nd. In the Conrad Hilton Hotel, which is no longer a Hilton Hotel, as I found out when I went looking for it. And here's a sense of the scale for you. There's 358 booths, 138 exhibitors, which are not all manufacturers. Some of them are people who make test equipment, some of them are distributors and whatnot, and some of them aren't direct selling games. Some of them are these Japanese companies that are kind of just there to represent their product, and potentially for overseas buyers if they don't have a contract with an American manufacturer to do it overseas. Like Namco actually did not go through Bally initially for their overseas stuff with Pac-Man. And overall, 7,400 attendees, which of course, was record-breaking. The industry just growing and growing. It's about 400 over the previous year. And just as kind of, before we start getting to the specific games, a couple comments from the coin-op magazines that I thought were interesting. One was about the video cocktail games. Back in the mid-'70s, they tried to make this thing where you had a table game, and you would push it into establishments that wouldn't want a big upright game because it would be kind of disturbing, and it's something you could just set your drink on and play a game. And basically the Americans thought that the cocktail had finally arrived, that we were finally going to get a huge supply of cocktail games. And, there were a couple, and of course Pac-Man's the biggest one. But they were taking off what they were seeing in Japan with Space Invaders, where everything was in a tabletop form game. But it did not wind up being, the number one thing in the arcade, because we had arcade spaces where we could put, whatever amount of games into that were all upright. There were different forms of cabinets that were there at the time, like Atari had introduced its new cabaret style, which was a shorter sort of cabinet. But, overall, there wasn't much of a change on that front. Though there was a new sort of innovation that was being displayed by many of the companies on the show floor, which was overhead monitors. Something where you could watch somebody play the game with a monitor that's set way above the cabinet. And I don't know really how practical these are in an actual arcade, and especially you have another thing you gotta test and tweak.
Well, actually, I can tell you from experience, because these were quite popular in some arcades in Argentina when I was a teenager, because these were locations that weren't in a strip mall. They were locations that were on city streets. So the arcade would just be on the street when you'd be walking by. And they would always have these cabinets with the extra monitors near the big windows, so the storefront windows, and you're walking by and you see your first glimpse of Altered Beast or Sly Spy or any of these new games, and you wouldn't have been able to see the game because there's people around the cabinet looking at it, but from the street you can still see this monitor up above. It got me into more than one little arcade that I probably wouldn't have walked into otherwise. So, probably a pain in the butt to maintain, but yes.
I don't think it was ever a hugely practical thing, but I don't think it was a bad idea. It was just, I'm not. How much can an operator take of service headaches, especially if they're not an experienced operator like was starting to come into the industry in 1980? But, if it worked, it worked. Bally sold specific dual monitor setup in 1982 for a couple of their games, and I know a lot of Dragon's Lair cabinets would be affixed with a monitor above the first one. I've seen one, so I can attest to that. And one other interesting thing before we start delving into the games is that just a month earlier, they had the JAA show, the Japanese Amusement Association show in Japan. And something that was remarked upon is that they did not show a lot of their hit games there. And this basically goes right back to, in the podcast, you were talking about the Galaxian thing, where, it was ripped off by all corners. And this is basically a defense mechanism that they could get their licensing all settled. And, you have an American company in the U.S. that could protect them from gray imports and straight-up clones before they actually put it out on the show floor. A couple of these games were already out, so they didn't necessarily need to show them. Like Pac-Man was already out. But, they kept it away from the show, where you would have many foreign distributors and whatnot coming in to see these games. So they would only get a sight of things once they were at the big show. Though, interestingly enough, it was also remarked that there were a lot of foreign visitors at the AMOA, about 1,000 of them, but not a huge amount of Japanese. In fact, a lot of the Japanese companies were represented pretty much solely by their American staff. And you can see this in the pictures and whatnot. Some of the presidents would fly out and whatnot, but they didn't have their cadres with them, which they kind of normally would. They were probably too busy making, stuff in Japan, because, it's the boom's happening at the same time as it is here.
Gotcha. And we've talked about it on the show. The establishment of Nintendo of America happens just a few months before this show. Yeah. And so you have that slow realization by the Japanese that they do not want to be relying on American licensing for their games, and that it's not that difficult to establish a base of operations in the U.S. similar to what companies like Sony did and so forth decades earlier. So, okay, so we have the JAA just happened. We're coming into the AMOA. What are the pre-shows like? Who's doing
well, there
stuff
isn't.
before?
Yeah, there's not a lot of pre-shows, but something that Sega Gremlin had started doing the prior year was a pre-show, which is basically it was held on the 30th because the 30th was kind of a registration day for the real AMOA show, so you could just, you don't have to wait in line at the ticket booth. But this was a cool marketing thing that they sort of did, and even though their games aren't that remarkable, it was this very effective way to convince the distributors who were already in town and everything that their product was going to be something exciting. And they had this big presentation in one of the hotel rooms where they had basically everybody come up, Frank Fogelman and David Rosen and a couple of their technician people to talk about all the cool new features that they have going and show some of the videotapes. And something else to add to the show notes is some of those videotapes that I got from Frank Fogelman.
Oh, really?
Which, yeah, we posted a thing on the Video Game History Foundation because I got those tapes digitized. And, it's a lot of service stuff and corporate sales stuff. And it wasn't what was shown specifically at the 1980 AMOA, but it gives you an idea of kind of how they would market to people with these VHS tapes, which was a unique way of doing it at the time. You didn't have to send a salesperson out; you just sent a tape, and it would do the sales for you. So they had games like Carnival, Moon Cresta, Space Firebird, which is a Nintendo game. Yes, Sega distributed Nintendo games before they got fully into the U.S. And also Space Tactics, which was really seen as like one of the highlights of the show. Not a lot of people know about Space Tactics. It's not that remarkable a game. It was, just a Japanese kind of Space Invaders clone, but it was a pretty big hit in its time, and especially it had a wraparound cabinet that you sat in. So
okay.
That was an attractive feature. And Carnival is a really cool game, but it's not something that kind of changes the way the games are played. It's more of a throwback, really. It's like a game about shooting cans, in a scrolling carnival wheel. It's a cool game, though.
Yeah, I've seen screenshots of it and ads for it. Okay, so that's Sega Gremlin. Let's get to the show itself.
Yep. All right. So, if people know one thing about the 1980 AMOA, it is probably something that they read in Stephen Kent's Ultimate History of Video Games, where it was said that Midway had 2 games on the show floor from Namco, and basically no one cared about this little yellow guy over here, and they only cared about this new car racing game that they had called Rally X, and it was the hit of the show. And basically everyone was raving about Rally X, and nobody knew that Pac-Man was going to be Pac-Man, the hit that changes everything. And Keith Smith already did an article on this, so we can link to that to just kind of see some of the language that was used in the coin-op magazines at the time. And, that doesn't record every thought, and, maybe somebody thought that Rally X was a big thing. But really, Rally X gets, barely any mention. Pac-Man not only gets some closer examination, it gets photos of people playing it. It also has full-page color ads taken out by Midway. Okay. Namco had its own ads where they had everything that they were kind of pushing at the time, and it was headed by Pac-Man because Pac-Man was already big in Japan. But Midway did not have Midway had confidence in Pac-Man. It's not that they were entirely surprised by the sort of runs that it did. They were putting marketing muscle behind it. And so it's very hard to claim that, Rally X was getting more attention than Pac-Man. And Replay actually had a ranking. This isn't in Keith's post. I don't know why he didn't put it there. But Replay had a ranking of the games they thought were the best of the show. Number 5 is Defender, which we'll get to. 4 is Rally X. 3 is Pac-Man. 2 is Space Tactics. And number 1 is Berserk, which of course we'll get to. So that, if you're just looking for a strict numerical way to identify how the industry reacted to Pac-Man, there you go. Like, you can look at the specific language, and like I said, Keith already did this. It pretty much well improves that Pac-Man was noticed, even though it wasn't going to be declared the hit of the show. Various editors had their own picks, but Pac-Man was not a complete surprise. There was already starting to be a push behind it from Bally Midway, and they knew it was going places, even if they could never anticipate where it was going to go. I'm glad that that's the case, because I don't like Rally X. I think it's not a good game at all.
I've never warmed up to it. I've tried it several times, but I honestly never warmed up to it. It lacks the scrolling, hurts the game, because you never really have the overview. There's
a radar, but
it's not the same.
You have to change your view to go and see it, and it's not like a couple of the other games we'll be talking about that have a radar.
It's the same difference between playing Super Off-Road and RC Pro-Am. RC Pro-Am, I know it's a classic. All Nintendo fanboys love it. I honestly, it leaves me cold, because I can't be bothered to memorize the track, and the scrolling means I always get stuck someplace because I didn't see the turn coming in time. Give me the entire field on one screen, and I'm a happy camper. And that's where Pac-Man succeeds and Rally X fails. But okay.
Yes.
Getting off on tangents.
Yeah, it's kind of an illustrative example. And, Rally X did well, and it got a sequel and whatnot. It's not like Rally X was a failure and Pac-Man was a success. The other two games that Namco had propositioned, Tank Battalion and King Balloon, were kind of forgotten. And Tank Battalion's pretty good. I haven't played King Balloon. They were being shown by another company called Game Plan, where the story is that Mr. Ken Anderson of Game Plan did a coin flip to choose which two games out of Namco he was going to get, and he really wanted Tank Battalion, so when he won, he chose Tank Battalion, not Pac-Man.
So apparently his plan was not a very good plan.
And whether that story is true or not, it's pretty fun. Of course, there was a sort of convalescence of maze game stuff. It wasn't just Pac-Man going on at the time. There was also Spectar from Exidy, which was kind of like Head-On, which is kind of an inspiration from Pac-Man, even though Mr. Iwatani has not said that. It is definitely an inspiration for Pac-Man. But Spectar was kind of an evolution on the Head-On formula, and since it was a maze game, it was kind of this. It was lumped into the same sort of category at the time. Then there, and Pac-Man's big, and we don't need to go into how Pac-Man was made and everything, but there is a new
this is a quick question. Was the name already changed to Pac-Man at the show? Okay.
Yeah, and I talked to the guy who says he changed the name, Satish Bhutani, who left for Data East, which we'll be talking about, right before the AMOA show. So there's a couple pictures of him heading the Data East booth, and Namco has its own booth, and Midway has its own booth. So one new type of game that was starting to be shown at the AMOA were platformers. And the primary one of these was a game from Universal, which not the movie studio.
Yeah.
Universal Company Limited from Japan, which is now Yaruze. It was showing a game called Space Panic. And Space Panic was based on a Japanese computer game that was made in about 1979 called Hyankyo Alien. And this was made at the the University of Tokyo Science Group, TSG. And it was made in the aftermath of Space Invaders. There was this major news publication that came around called Weekly Asahi that was looking for ideas of what kind of game can conquer Space Invaders. And they didn't really have anything at the time, but they started thinking about games. They're computer people. They have these microcomputers, and one of these guys has an Apple II. And he decides, maybe we should make some sort of game. And they make this game that has kind of a maze, and you have to dig holes in order to trap aliens beneath them. You dig a hole and they fall in the hole, and then you have to cover the hole over. It's kind of a gruesome way to go, but that's when you need to fight the aliens, there's no brutality, which is not called for. Don't take that out of context. And as far as I can tell, before it was actually published in any magazines, it was picked up by a small Japanese arcade company. So it actually appeared at the JAA in 1979. So it was already an arcade game, and it didn't really do much in the United States. There were versions of it in the United States. Actually, Sega put out one called Digger, which was actually made here. I still need to figure out what that story is. I have met the guy who programmed it.
You mean in the States or?
Yeah, it was made at Gremlin. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So I met the guy who made it, and I still haven't figured out exactly how they wound up making a clone of Hyankyo Alien, which was not, it didn't even come over here. But Hyankyo Alien was definitely an influence on Space Panic, because Space Panic is the same sort of thing, except it's vertical. Instead of going around a top-down maze, you go up ladders to trap these different colored aliens inside of the holes, and then you pat them down, and they fall down, and how far they fall will give you more points. It's kind of like Burger Time in that sense, and some of you might know it's kind of like Lode Runner.
I was about to say, it sounds a lot like Lode Runner, but Lode Runner doesn't come out until 83.
Yeah, Lode Runner was based on a description of Space Panic. It was not based on Space Panic itself. The guy who made it had never seen Space Panic. But Lode Runner has the same idea of you dig holes in these bricks to trap enemies. So Space Panic is kind of the first platformer in a sense. There's not any jumping, but there's a use of vertical space, single screen, and it's a lot like Donkey Kong in a way. You can definitely see the influence if you look at them side by side, even though that's, again, something that's not been admitted to explicitly. So Space Panic can kind of be called the first platformer. It had come out a couple of months earlier in Japan. Another game that another Japanese company was debuting here was Crazy Climber by Nichibitsu. Crazy Climber is a different kind of platformer. I would still classify it as a platformer. You can call it whatever you want, really. But basically, you're climbing up a building, and there are these windows that will open up, and people will drop flower pots out of them. Apparently, people just have hundreds of these things. They're just throwing out skyscraper windows. And so you have to ascend up the tower to get to a helicopter to take off. So it's something about vertical ascent. It has vertical scrolling. And there's even a little King Kong guy like halfway up the skyscraper. So maybe you could say it's a little something to do with Donkey Kong. But it was ripped off a lot. There's definitely a lot of console games from the era that take from Crazy Climber, and it's a neat little game. It's almost kind of like an endless runner in a way. You're not trapped to just keep moving, but it just sort of, you make it up to the top of the tower, then you go to the next level, and the obstacles get harder. Classic arcade game sort of thing, but it's a different sort of game because both Space Panic and Crazy Climber have articulated humans. that are doing more elaborate moves than you would see from something like a spaceship.
Yeah.
So it's a new type of game that's starting to emerge, a game which involves the physicality of the human body, even if they're very weird looking humans.
Very true. And it's also allowing more movement. I mean, Space Invaders and most of these games let you move left and right and so forth, but the idea of being able to move up, down, left, right, through a space, restrictions through ladders and so forth, that's a level of complexity, well, to be honest, probably wouldn't have been possible on Space Invaders hardware, let alone with the graphics of the time.
Yeah, there's a huge explosion in the capability of hardware, basically after Galaxian, in part because the Galaxian board was farmed out to a lot of these smaller Japanese companies to manufacture it because Namco couldn't keep ahead of the manufacturing at the time. So there was definitely an arms race in terms of technology. And since we mentioned Galaxian, we mentioned Donkey Kong, let's talk Nintendo. So yes. Nintendo makes their first appearance at the AMOA in 1980. And they're showing this game, which I'm sure many Nintendo fans will know the name of, even if they've never looked it up, called Radar Scope.
Mm-hmm.
And Radar Scope is kind of a Galaxian-alike with a sort of cool 3D effect. It's more advanced than what you would have gotten on Galaxian. And, Nintendo had been making other games before this. So they had, in a sense, they had expertise, even though they weren't doing the programming of it. But, they had some sort of ability to work with this hardware and its limitations and whatnot. And it was a Nintendo booth, but it was mainly headed by two gentlemen named Al Stone and Ron Judy. Judy and Stone were out of Washington, out of Seattle, and they had a trucking company that they called Chase Express. And they did a lot of just, shipping stuff around the country, and they would do stuff with stuff that they imported as well. And they had a friend in Hawaii who ran a trading company, and that got them a contact with Nintendo. And they started selling, just as a little sideline, to distribute Space Fever games from Nintendo, which was a Space Invaders knockoff. And they started putting out a couple of these just as kind of a coin route thing. You got these trucks, you can put stuff wherever you want, really. And they start raking in the money from it because we're right at the height of the video game boom. And so they're like, okay, maybe we should just stop the trucking and become coin-op operators now, or distributors, rather. So they formed this company called Far East Video. And Far East Video would basically be not really an exclusive distributor because they were putting out these games to these other companies like Sega, but they would handle a lot of Nintendo's American operations. They did have an office in New York, and very shortly after this expo, they're going to open their offices in Redmond, or start constructing it, rather, to be closer to home. But Far East Video, from Al Stone and Ron Judy, is what helps Nintendo get a name in America. And of course, the famous story is that they imported 3,000 of these Radar Scope cabinets because it was big in Japan, and this is actually something we can verify. It is something that shows up at the JAA show. But, for whatever reason, and it's probably because, even though this might be hard for the 80s kids to believe, Nintendo was a no-name. They had no recognition in the United States in 1980. Absolutely none. They were completely unable to sell these Radar Scope machines. The number is that it was 3,000 they imported, and they only sold 1,000 of them. Ooh, so they're like, oh god, okay. Yeah, it was a failure. And, it wasn't going to end them, really. They were opening a new facility. They had money. But, they wanted something that they could do something with these cabinets. So they call back to Japan and say, hey, we need something to put in Radar Scope machines. And so the project gets underway, that would become Donkey Kong. But that's a story for another time.
Yes. Okay, so we've got Nintendo. We've talked about Sega. We've touched on Namco. Who's next on the list?
Well, another big trend, aside from these Japanese games that was still dominating the US, was going to be vector games. Vector games had just taken off in 1978 with Cinematronic Space Wars. Technically, it showed up at the 1977 AMOA, but the first unit started shipping in January 1978. So Vector was still a pretty appealing thing, but only a couple companies would actually tap into it. None of the Japanese companies would do that. Of course, you had the major producers like Exidy would tap into it. Cinematronics, that was kind of their gimmick. They were pretty much only did vector games for a while, and then also Atari. So let's start with Cinematronics. Now we must go all the way back to this 1977 period when Cinematronics first got in their vector hardware. And it was brought to them by this guy named Larry Rosenthal, an MIT grad, who just started working on a briefcase full of hardware that became a vector game, and he sold them this hardware as a patent, basically, that they could use this hardware, and they create the game Space Wars. But for one reason or another, he's never been entirely clear on this, Larry Rosenthal didn't want to really work with Cinematronics anymore. So he decided to go found his own company called Vector Beam. And Cinematronics could still use the technology they had there, but he was no longer there to help program it for them. And through serendipitous means, they were able to continue to keep making vector games, but that's a different story. So Vector Beam exists for about a year, but since he's just he started up a new company to make this very sort of expensive, finicky hardware, he's able to put out a few games and hire some good programmers, but like Cinematronics really just wants to own his patents. And they're like, just sell out to us, please. let's stop this. And of course, Vector Beam was losing money, so it wasn't in the cards for him to keep on doing his own separate manufacturer thing. So eventually, he sells out to them and he leaves. But one game that they were working on when Larry was still there, he originated this concept, was a game called Oops. And Oops is a game about contraception. Let's put it that way. So the player is an ovary and has to fight off. I don't know. There's no easy sanitized way to put this. Sperm. He is an object in the center of the screen that has to stop all these things that are coming in from the sides to try and inseminate, basically. I don't know if there's a better way.
I think our listeners are mature enough to be able to handle this filthy language that you're dropping on us right now.
I'm using as clinical an expression as I can here. So,
is there an attract mode that gives the story ahead of the game?
Vector games didn't tend to have a lot of attract modes in them.
Oh.
Yeah, we're not to the point where you get story in these games. Unfortunately, we will never know the full story of Oops game because Oops game is not what they put out for various reasons. So they were working on this at Vector Beam, which is in a separate city from Cinematronics, but there was Vector Beam was slowly being absorbed into Cinematronics. It's kind of complicated, not getting into that right now, but one of the programmers they had at Cinematronics was a guy named Tim Skelly, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year. And he saw this Oops game, that was being worked on by this guy named Dan Sunday, because Larry Rosenthal had left. And he thought that they should change it to something, space themed, basically. So they didn't have to deal with these adult sort of, adult themes.
Yes.
And they started enhancing the game as this sort of shooter. You're in the middle of the screen shooting stuff that's coming from on the edges of the screen. And he realized that it just wasn't very fun to be the one in the center. So instead, they changed it around, that you're the character on the outside trying to destroy the thing that's in the middle of the screen. And they also added a barrier around the outside of things. And if you played a game like Yar's Revenge, you might kind of know like how this game works. And it was eventually called Star Castle, which is a very weird name. I don't understand. It's the castle in the middle because it's got walls around it. It's a ship that you'd go and destroy. And that ship in the center can send out ships to go and attack you on the outside. But it's a real classic of the age. And it was... And Skelly and the programmer, Scott Bowden, who I interviewed, don't really consider the Oops game to be the same thing as this Star Castle game because it kind of changed fundamentally, but it was definitely an influence in how the game eventually turned out. And if you squint a little bit and you use your imagination, you can kind of see the original concept hanging in there. And maybe since most arcade game players are male, maybe it should have been the outside coming in from all along. But that's
It doesn't have the same artistic integrity as Star Castle.
True, and it's a good game. It's one of those real Vector classic games that shows the versatility of Vector in this time period. It's silky smooth, goes real fast, and it was just a pretty big hit for Cinematronics. And one other thing to note about it is that I was talking before about the Chicago companies just starting to tip their toe in video. Rockola, who's famous for jukeboxes, decided they were going to distribute Star Castle outside of the U.S. They weren't going to get heavily into trying to do games themselves yet. This is something that's kind of starting at all of these companies, and we'll get to the culmination of that in a little bit. But they did not see themselves as getting too heavily into video at the time, so we'll just distribute a couple of other companies' stuff in like a cocktail format or doing something outside the U.S. because Cinematronics doesn't have a European operation. So then the second one up is Atari. And Atari, of course, the prior year had the smash hit Asteroids, which was just like the biggest thing around. And they brought it back to this show this year. And they also had Missile Command there. A lot of times these companies will bring stuff from the prior year to just kind of have there, especially if they don't have a lot of new products. But, they're still selling and whatnot. Asteroid sells 65,000 overall. But the big new Vector game that they bring in is Battlezone. And Battlezone, for me, represents kind of an important point in these first-person games. It's not the first-person game, and I don't think even in the arcade it's necessarily the first-person game, depending on how you define this. But it's the first game of this lot that kind of defines a immersive space, a space that you can kind of be in. And of course that's helped by the fact that you get this periscope that you can peer into on the full version of the cabinet, which of course gets real sweaty if the arcade operator doesn't clean it. But, that's why they took it out in later versions. So Battlezone came about from brainstorming sessions at Atari, as a lot of their interesting game concepts did. And there was this particular concept, which there's actually a document for, so we can actually see some of the evolution of Battlezone, that was called First Person Tank. There's a little drawing on this document of how this game would sort of look. You were basically in a maze, and you were a tank, and you were shooting other tanks. It was basically a version of Atari/Key Games' Tank from 1974, but first person. So it was an attempt to use this new vector hardware that they had, and especially this new thing that they had called the Math Box. And the Math Box was like this very sophisticated piece of vector generating hardware. And on Jed Margolin's site, he describes a bit more about what this is. It uses bit slices and things like that. And so the project of the first-person tank went one way, and then they went for a second version of the game, which was called Red Baron, which was a flying rail shooter game. They were co-developed basically at the same time in terms of technology, though the games are very different because Battlezone is free roaming. You have the opportunity to go around this maze and find, well, not maze, but it's kind of an open environment with obstacles, and find things that you want to shoot. And it was headed by Ed Rotberg as the lead guy, and then Owen Rubin helping out with some of the other additional programming, like the famous volcano, which you cannot reach, no matter what they tell you. You cannot reach the volcano in Battlezone. And, you know, they work to create this very advanced game that can I don't know what it's something that had never really been seen in the arcade before, even though, as I said, technically there are first-person games that predate this, like Starship 1, and Vector Beam did a game that was kind of first-person, but this is a free-roaming game that you are in a world, a space, that you can go around in. And tanks are coming in from all sides, and they develop the radar concept, just like in Rally X, basically, where you get a sense of everything that's around you, and it turns with you, shows you where the enemies are. Even then, because it's so slow to turn your tank, you may not be able to shoot them before they completely destroy you. Battlezone is very difficult.
Yes. What you just describes, I believe, the 2 or 3 times I've actually tried to play a Battlezone cabinet. Mm-hmm. And yes, I got into it, spotted somebody, and then realized, oh, there's somebody else, and boom, I was dead. So,
part of that is that they used an actual tank controls, not the PlayStation version of tank controls, but the 2 levers that go forward and back, and you have to do each combination to move forward, back, left, right. And it's a very cool tactile experience. And Tank in 1974 had these controls as well. But since you're immersed in a first-person version of this world, as abstract a world as it is, it's some alien moon technically, but you can really feel the rumble, even though there's no rumble on it. It's that kind of game where you just the sparseness of it really allows you to focus.
That's true.
On the experience. So that's Atari.
Yeah.
So let's look at another interesting concept that was debuted at the AMOA, even though it's not really about the games necessarily. But Data East would make its first showing here. They had just founded their American operation, Data East USA, and they were introducing this new thing called the Deco system, the Deco cassette system, I should say, because a lot of people get confused that the Deco stands for Data East Cassette something. They can never figure out what the O is, but actually Deco is Data East Corporation. And then it's the Deco cassette system. It's not meant to be a holistic acronym. So Data East was founded as sort of a test equipment and measuring company for electrical engineering sort of stuff. But the guy who founded it, Tetsuo Fukuda, had worked a little bit in coin-op things. He developed a light gun that I'm not sure if it actually went anywhere, but he did present it to some cornet manufacturer. And in 1977, they started getting into metal games, which were these redemption-style games that were huge in Japan until Space Invaders ate up everything else. And after that, they got into the video game boom, as Space Invaders came along, and they created a lot of just straight-off clone games, and, nothing all too remarkable. But in 1980, they decided they were going to make a big splash with their Deco cassette system. The Deco cassette system is system hardware, which was a new concept in arcades at the time, where it was a base unit that you would buy as an operator, and then you could have different games by getting cassettes, not ROM boards like later games, not cartridges like a couple later system hardwares. These were actual cassettes that you would have to load into the memory of the machine. It was a larger than a normal cassette. You could store more data than you could on like your Apple II or something like that. But very fragile medium. I think it was in this kind of big plastic casing. There's very few of these around. In fact, the guy that I mentioned earlier, Satish Bhutani, who was president of Data East USA, he still has one of these, which is like remarkable because like you can't find these. The games have been dumped generally, but the actual units themselves, like they didn't sell a lot of these in the US. It did okay in Japan.
Now, when you say they're downloaded into ROM, now ROM or RAM?
Download into RAM. Did I say that wrong?
well, you said memory. Sorry, but so my question is: did you have every time you booted up the cabinet? Did you have to load it anew?
I don't think it's maybe after you turn off the power, but it's not like every time somebody has to do a game, you have to do that. It's just you don't have to get a ROM chip board and plug it into something. So there was ways of doing the data transfer, and they chose cassettes because I guess it was what they knew in Japan. The Walkman comes from there. They're probably pretty good with cassettes at the time. Yeah, it's slow access, but it's not going to kill your arcade game necessarily. It's not that the system was necessarily bad, but it has the problems of any system hardware in a rapidly evolving arcade space. A lot of the system hardwares that would be later successful, like the Nintendo Versus system and the CPS and the Neo Geo, they really came out in a period of time where there wasn't like a huge explosion in technology. It was kind of more of a gradual stepping up, and Capcom would do later versions of the CPS system as kind of building on that, so you wouldn't necessarily be stuck in the one rigid thing for years and years and years. Data East, they chose the wrong time to do it, and also their games were just not remarkable. Here's the 6 games that they launched with, and tell me if you recognize any of these. 5 games. The 5 games that they launched with, and tell me if you recognize any of these. Highway Chase, Nina, Missile Splinter, Terranian, and Manhattan.
I cannot say I recognize any of them.
and in part, this is because they were exclusive to the Deco system, the Deco cassette system. I keep messing that up myself, you see. And
but the Deco did produce one hit, didn't it?
Well, they had 2 hits, and they were both on the Deco system, which were Lock and Chase and Burger Time.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking Burger Time, but yeah. But that would
Burger Time was the bigger hit. And, they did more business with them as standalone arcade cabinets because operators weren't going to buy this system that locked you into a specific sort of game. It wasn't really necessary with the economics at the time. That changes later. But this was the first system. And one cool little thing that you can actually see on the flyers is that they have this little plastic thing for the joystick. So depending on what game you're loading, you can limit the joystick to just one direction or have it fully open. So, this is kind of like different button configurations that you might get with a control panel and whatnot. These are all simple games, so you wouldn't really need any sort of custom control. But I thought it was worth mentioning that the system hardware begins here. So it's taking elements from computer games and home games and putting them into the arcades.
Very cool. And who else is showing at the show?
Well, now we can start talking about the Chicago companies. All these people who were like, for pinball forever, pinball for life, we're never going to do anything but pinball. In 1979, they're like, okay, I guess we have to do video games now. Ho hum. But all of these companies did have people who had worked on video games before. And that's what allowed them to make a splash. That's what allowed them to make a splash at the show. They didn't have to go completely from scratch. They had very advanced engineers who were working on solid-state pinball games, and they could finally put together something to showcase their video chops. And we'll start with Stern Electronics. Stern Electronics, founded in 1977 from the purchase assets of Chicago Coin. Chicago Coin had not gotten on the solid-state train, and so they went into bankruptcy, and they were bought up. But, of course, since they didn't have any experience in solid-state, they weren't really given that much of a boost by purchasing the factory. So
now, wait, sorry, just for clarification for some listeners who may not be down with this, and I've mentioned it a few times, what do you mean by solid state?
Solid state electronics are electronics which are contained mostly inside the circuitry. You do not need to have a relay that counts something inside the system like a score. You can process it digitally and then have it go out to the score counter on a pinball machine we're talking about here and move the things. You do not need to have moving parts that may break down, moving other things. This giant, complicated electromechanical stuff underneath the hood. It's wires, not gears, is the way to put it. And there's combinations of this. There's mechanical, electromechanical, and then you get solid state. And of course, all pinball today is solid state because otherwise it would be very complicated to rig up some of these very elaborate systems that they got going on under the hood. Solid state pinball had been introduced commercially in 1976 by Bally, and so it took over the pinball world. And so when Stern Electronics is formed, not Stern Pinball, I almost made that mistake. I can't believe I just did that. Yeah, despite what Wikipedia tells you, Stern Electronics and Stern Pinball are not the same company at all. But putting that aside, it is the same guy, Gary Stern. I've shaken his hand. And they were a successful pinball company, but 1979 rolls around, they got to do video games. To help with their solid-state expertise, they purchased a company that was south of Chicago called Universal Research Laboratories, which had been doing solid-state stuff for quite a while. They went back to the original Pong boom, but they slowly fell apart. They were in bankruptcy, so Stern Electronics purchased their assets and brought over their people as well. And one of those people that they brought over was a guy named Tony Miller, who had also been working at Dave Nutting Associates, which was in Wisconsin originally, then moved down to Arlington Heights in Illinois. And he developed this hardware for them, which was not a super sophisticated hardware. It was a black and white sort of thing, but it was something to get them going. And Miller brought in this guy named Alan McNeil. Alan McNeil was another person who had been a programmer at Dave Nutting Associates, and he had programmed the sequel to their games Western Gun and Seawolf, Boot Hill and Seawolf 2. And then he asked Dave Nutting, hey, how about I get to program some games myself, original concepts. some design work, basically. And Dave Nutt is saying, no, 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 no. You need more experience. And so he was like, I don't want to deal with that. He left. He went to join URL, which was at this time under Stern. And so he was working on pinball games and doing a couple, the programming underneath the hood for a lot of these games. But then when video games come up, he's basically the only guy in the company with experience with them. So he gets to lead the video game project. And, as someone who's working with all of these microprocessors and whatnot, he was an early adopter of microcomputers. And as you have seen in your many combings of microcomputer magazines, one of the most popular things in microcomputers at the time were type-in listings. And there was this one game that originally appeared in People's Computer Company newsletter called Chase, which was a game that was kind of like a roguelike, almost. You're in this open space, and there's enemies around you, and there's mines that will kill the enemies if they run into them. So basically, to use an MMO term, you need to kite the enemies into the mines because they're going to take the most expedient route towards you. And you have to kill all of these enemies before they get you or you run into a mine. So Alan McNeil thought, hey, we could take this game that kind of has an action component and put it into an arcade game, make it real time. We found when he did that the enemies just moved too fast, and you were not able to defend yourself because in the original Chase game you had no other means of survival. You could just run. That was it. So he started thinking around, okay, what can I do besides this to make it so the robots can't get you as fast? And so he hits upon the concept of a maze. Mazes were just the thing at the time. It was just like, here's a way you can create a single screen with more complexity by putting walls up, and you create a maze. And not only would he create a maze, he would also randomize the types of mazes that you would find in each level. And he did that through, a little random number generator with a seed, so you could actually walk back into your previous space. And this is kind of a new sort of concept. If you had a game, it just kind of scrolled one way, and the world behind you didn't matter. But in this case, you could walk to the next screen, then come back and find a screen cleared. And this is something that even modern games have problems with, that you return to a state where you have changed the nature of the play space. But of course, when you don't have any more enemies in the room, oh yeah, I forgot to mention, he gave the player a blaster so that they could kill the robots as they were, because he had this dream about robots coming in to attack him. Alan McNeil was an interesting figure. He died last year of a heart attack out of the blue. So you had a game where you could return to these rooms, and he didn't think of just booting you to the next level. You have to actually walk to the next screen after you're done clearing the enemies. And so you have these empty rooms, so how do you force a player to keep moving? And of course, the way he does that is with a genuine yellow smiley face named Evil Otto. Evil Otto was named after a guy from Dave Nutting Associates, who was described to me by other people as Jeff Fredrickson's gopher. Not to be too defamatory on air here, but he was formerly a bus driver who came to work at Dave Nutting Associates as an assistant to the main technician, who was Jeff Fredrickson. And he became sort of a manager, and he started giving mandates down to the programmers of when they could work and what attire they could wear, and putting music over the PA that nobody was a particular fan of. So he was this overly corporate man in a place where it was not supposed to be corporate. So he decided to make him the lovingly tributed in this game with a little yellow smiley face which was all the rage at the time in the 70s. This little yellow smiley face thing, which you will probably recognize from Watchmen, but it's not from that. This game, which is a top-down game where you shoot the robots inside of these one-screen mazes, and you go to the next screen, and you transition kind of like in the dungeons in Zelda. You go to the edge of the screen, and then it scrolls over. So it's not real scrolling, but you move into the next area, and then you start blasting away again until they're all dead, unless they're inside of a box, which you cannot shoot inside of, in which case you have to wait for the robot to run into the wall. And this game was called Berserk. And I mentioned earlier it was top of the replay picks for the show. But it was not the game that attracted the most attention at the show, which of course was the seminal classic Defender.
Well, and seminal now, we need to talk about this because Defender, the story I've always heard is that, and this was the classic one way back before I started researching this stuff, was the facet of the AMOA show in 1980 was Pac-Man was too simplistic, Defender was too complicated, therefore neither one is ever going to succeed. That was the legend that was going around.
I mean, Defender is a very complicated game. But at the time, it was just like, oh my God, Williams, the huge pinball company, is doing a video game. So in the trades, you wouldn't get something like that. You didn't really have player perspectives at the time. They start bringing those in as competitive gaming becomes more of a thing, but you wouldn't really get comments at the time of whether this game was too difficult. Really, it was just everyone was astounded. It was on the front page of one of the magazines. Just like this is a huge leap forward for a company that's known for its huge technology focus. Williams was number 2 behind Bally and pinball at the time, but they were still known as this very aggressive company in terms of its technology. And it starts with their foray into solid-state pinball. When they were first looking into creating a system, they partnered with National Semiconductor to do the chips for them. And the representative from National Semiconductor who came over was a guy named Mike Stroll. Mike Stroll was this brilliant technologist, and they decided, they were working with this guy on this system. They wanted him to lead technology at Williams and also at Seeburg, which was the parent corporation. So he was hired in to Seeburg to oversee all their technology stuff. This evolution into solid state, which they needed to undertake. And of course, they were just doing pinballs, and then eventually they got to do video games. They made a Pong, or they imported a Pong game in 1973. So that was technically Williams's first video game, but it doesn't really count. There were the other Chicago area companies were importing games as well. Like Gottlieb had this one called No Man's Land, but that's not remarkable really. But Williams decides to set up an internal team, and to head this, they have this guy named Ken Fedesna, who I forget. I need to look this up now because I can't remember if he was also employed at Atari. Steve Ritchie was at Atari. I knew that. No, I guess he wasn't. Okay. So they had a video game team that was headed by this guy, Ken Fedesna, who was the guy building the hardware, basically. And they needed to create something that was going to create a huge splash. And over time, as they're brainstorming things, one of the guys from the pinball division starts to trickle in, a guy named Eugene Jarvis, who, of course, is still the head of Raw Thrills over in Illinois here. He's kind of carrying on the torch of the last vestiges of the arcade video game, which, might be coming back, who knows. But, Raw Thrills is kind of the one big company in arcade video games at the moment. And Jarvis had worked at Atari in their pinball division, which they had set up in 1976 to exploit their own solid-state technology. And they never really did well for various reasons. And so Jarvis eventually, they just had to let him go. And also designer that also came to Williams named Steve Ritchie. And eventually he makes it over to Williams, and he's doing tables like Gorgar and things like that, which, has synthesized speech. And eventually he gets into the video game project. He wasn't really assigned to that, but he came over, and he's like, okay, I'm taking over now. Basically, he's the guy who starts leading the design of the video game project. And of course, he's a good programmer too. You need to be in these days, otherwise you're not gonna get anywhere. And he's very enamored with Space Invaders and sort of the raw thrills of that kind of game. There's definitely something to that name, I would have to say. But he wanted to create just a sort of basic Space Invader style game, but you can shoot diagonally. But it wasn't, that wasn't really much. You're still at the bottom of the screen, and you can just shoot in a couple different directions. And so that same sort of mentality of having more freedom around the screen leads him to look more closely at asteroids. And of course, in asteroids, you can go all around the screen, but you wrap around to the other side. He thinks that, you should be able to explore more of a world. In a way that instead of just going off one side of the screen and then never being able to go back like other scrolling games, you can go backwards. So you have a two-way direction and a limited space that you can travel around, but you can scroll around inside of it. And within this, you are shooting aliens that are coming down to the center of this moon. It's a pretty basic sort of game. They come up with some cool tricks and cool explosion effects, courtesy of a couple of the programmers there, but it just doesn't have a focus. And they spend a lot of time. Jarvis was insistent on this, that they create these little men on the surface of the moon that are just wandering around. They're just window dressing. They don't add anything to the game. But then in August, as he tells it, of 1980, he suddenly realizes, wait, those little men can provide the direction for the game. You can, there are these aliens coming in, and what if they're coming down to take these men? And you can rescue these men for additional points. It becomes a directive. You're not just destroying all the aliens on the screen, moving around. It's got a radar too. Yeah, radars was like the big thing of the 1980 AMOA. But
that and mazes.
Yes, radars and mazes. We're kind of linked in a sort of way. It's the precursor of the modern mini-map, basically. And you can suddenly, all these flashy effects suddenly mean something. That it is a defense of, these innocent humanoids on the surface of the world. You're just going back and forth, shooting the aliens, deciding which aliens you're going to kill first. And, it's just this, it becomes an intense experience. We'll talk a little bit about how it plays later, because they decided when they were getting ready for the AMOA show, they needed to add some stuff because they hadn't entirely finished everything. This last-minute addition of the people on the ground, and they also hadn't made an attract mode yet. So since they're in Chicago, and they can, I'm trying to remember. The Williams factory is like, I don't know, 30 minutes drive west of where the Conrad Hilton would be, basically. So they ship out the cabinets, and they're still working on the game at headquarters on the 30th, the pre-day of the AMOA. They get there in the morning of the 31st, and they have a set of ROMs ready to go. They start installing it, and somebody puts it in backwards, so it fries.
Ooh.
Yeah. So they completely destroy their run, but thankfully they made a backup. So Defender comes to life for the right before the show is about to open. So they finish it just in time for it to be shown to all the waiting public, and they had already taken out print advertisements and everything to make sure that this game made a big splash. And of course it did. It was this surprise hit of the show, and whether or not it is too difficult, it is, by the way. it definitely made an impression. And yeah, Defender, I hate the controls. You have 5 buttons, including a hyperspace, which is taken from Space War, and a smart bomb, which can clear the whole screen. Kind of like in beat 'em ups, where you can throw down the special thing. But you have a lever. I can't call it a joystick because it only goes up and down. That will control your altitude. You have a reverse button that will allow you to change direction. And then you have a thrust button that will send you forward. So you have to spider your hands around this cabinet to make sure that you hit everything. But it was at the point where the players were looking for something more complex. They did want to have something that evolved on something like Asteroids. And of course, the audio-visual splendor of it is just amazing. Even looking at it today, just like in terms of pixel effects, it can generate 256 colors. It's the emblematic game of the arcade, basically. It is an icon of the moment. And so it really does deserve its place as kind of the real king of the AMOA. Even Pac-Man sold more, but Defender exemplified what the arcade was at that moment. And because it was so flashy, Stern with Berserk basically realized, oh god, we can't do a black and white game. We need color right now. So they hacked together a color system for Berserk, and that's why it's in color.
Gotcha.
And it also might have influenced one Japanese attendee that was there, Kagemasa Kozuki, who was the principal of Konami. There's this little passage, I'm not going to try to over-explain this, but there's a passage in this Japanese video game history book that says that Kagemasa Kozuki attended the 1980 AMOA, and he stared at Defender for a really long time. And I even asked the author, what does this mean? And he doesn't know. He doesn't know what he wrote at that point. But the sort of implication is that he saw a game and he wanted to make a game like it. And a couple of months later, they put out Scramble, which is a scrolling shooter. The classic shmup formula. It's horizontal rather than vertical, but it's the same sort of concept. It's a constantly scrolling forward shooter. And, Defender, you could scroll both ways. But it is possible that Defender inspired this, but it's a very tight gap. So Defender may have very wide-reaching influences, and, probably did inspire some shmups later. But Defender really is the capstone to the 1980 AMOA.
Yeah. And you are correct. The controls... My first encounter with Defender is the handheld version that became famous now because of Guardians of the Galaxy 2. But a buddy of mine had that. I probably killed his batteries, I don't know how many times as a kid, playing that over and over again. And then after that, I had it on the Commodore 64, where they reduced the whole thing to a regular joystick control, which made tremendously more sense and made the game actually easy to control and play. And then only years later, I believe the first time I played it may have been at a retro gaming convention in '99. It was can't remember the name of it. It was in Vegas, and I think that's where I played it for the first time in an arcade cabinet. And I was just like, I used to be really good at this. What the hell happened? Yeah.
Yeah, I have no idea why they didn't use a joystick. It was.
They were a pinball manufacturer. They had all these extra pinball buttons left. That's the only explanation I can come up with.
There you go. It's probably also cheaper to make a one-way lever than do a full joystick. But whatever the case, that's sort of the overview of the 1980 AMOA. To sum up, Pac-Man definitely garnered more attention than Rally X. Platformers begin here. And of course, you have Nintendo coming in for the first time, and this will, of course, lead to a platformer that was probably inspired by Space Panic. Then you have the emerging height of vector games and immersive worlds within arcade experiences, wider settings that you could sort of envelop in. You have system hardware appearing for the first time, even though it wasn't hugely successful at first. You have the major pinball companies forced to get into video, and that would be their fate until the crash either pushed them back into pinball or led them out of business. And you have this new technology standard being set by games like Defender and other types of games emerging, like Berserk eventually leads to the twin stick shooter, even though it's not twin stick. It was the frustration of not having a twin stick that led to the birth of Robotron 2084. But that's sort of why I think that the 1980 AMOA is this big transitional period. It in the larger sense, it expanded what video games could be. Even though they were still wed to the arcade and you had time limits and score chasing and all that, there was more to the video game now than just a single screen, blast at your friends, or rack up a high score. It was just a moment in time that I think deserves to be recognized.
And I don't believe I could have said it better myself. Not that I probably wouldn't have tried, but I couldn't have said it better myself. Ethan, thank you very, very much for this.
Thank you so much, Karl.
Detailed breakdown. It's hard to really overstate the importance of the arcade, especially at that time in the evolution of video games, and this moment where we're really getting every major player, the people with experience in the arcades getting involved. We have the Japanese getting directly involved in the North American market. Mm-hmm. It is becoming a global industry in reference to the arcades. And this is a watershed moment for that. And now, listeners, hopefully you can take away some appreciation from all of this.
Yeah, okay. And of course, in the coming months, you guys will be covering some of this and, whatever amount of detail you want to do. But really, it's just, it explodes exponentially from here. So you're going to have to pick what stories you're doing for the next couple of years.
Well, what we're going to be doing for the next few, we are going to be talking about some of this. We're going to be doing a brief overview probably in the November, just depending on the publication dates, because we try to stick to the publication dates.
Yeah, it's mostly the December publications that actually cover the AMOA, because it happens right at the beginning of November. So the November issues come out in November.
Okay. Yeah, so it's going to be somewhere in that range, and the individual games will probably get some talk about, especially when that Defender handheld gets licensed. As soon as I can find something on that, just because that was such an iconic piece at the time. I don't know if you ever
talking about the one with the mirrors, the one on the tabletop, right?
No. I'm talking about the actual handheld one. It was using not LEDs, but what were they called? Those vacuum lights things.
Vacuum fluorescent display.
Yeah, exactly. Look it up. It was pretty impressive because you could do both the flight left and right on it, and it had, the aliens coming down, picking up the humans. It had all those elements in a handheld package. And I think it ate through those giant big batteries like nobody's business, but I wasn't paying for them, so I didn't mind. Yeah. It was fun stuff.
Yeah.
And like I said, Guardians of the Galaxy, Teenage Groot is playing it all the time, addictively. And I could definitely, I was just thinking back to 8-year-old Karl doing exactly the same thing back in the day.
You are Groot.
I am Groot. That's all there is to it, yes. Any parting words?
Well, you can go find me at the Gaming Alexandria Discord server, which is always open. Just find Gaming Alexandria at Twitter, or go to the website gamingalexandria.com. You can visit my blog if you want to get deep into research. It's not a general kind of blog thing. It's like if you want to know about the things that I dig up just randomly, that's thehistoryofhowweplay.wordpress.com. And I'm also on Twitter at GameResearch_E. And I also started a new Twitter account where I look at old coin-op stuff. It's another deep research sort of thing that I felt just kind of was appropriate for Twitter and little random updates, called Our Lost Arcade.
Oh, cool. I don't even think I have that one on my follows yet.
Well, now you've got one.
Excellent. Well, Ethan, it's been a blast. Thank you very much.
Likewise.
And keep the corrections coming in every month because you just keep me honest.
I only do it because I love you.
Hey, I appreciate it. I really do, because if I don't get the corrections, I'm just going to get a really big head that I'm getting everything right, and this does force me to go that extra mile with my research usually.
And we discuss some things too, so it's not like I'm just yelling at him all the time.
All I have to say is you are wrong about Nintendo controllers.
Jeez. But I will say that by the new year you will have your 1981, 1991, and 2001 sound effects.
Oh, excellent. Well, hey, you may actually have to start doing a 1970, because I've been going back, little preview for. If you haven't listened to the October-ish episode yet, there is going to be a 50-year jump on that one. I found some. I check every month, and I haven't really found anything interesting. But this month, I have 2 big stories that I couldn't leave out. So.
All right. Well, more work for me, I guess.
Okay. But yes. Okay, man. That concludes this episode. Everybody, have fun. Don't do anything we wouldn't do.
Peace.
I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.